I'm going to ask now Franck Magennis to speak to us. Franck is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, very active on human rights and on this campaign. And his voice is often heard by all of us on social media. Franck, you know that a number of issues which are touching on legal rights have been raised here. I hope you can relate to them. And you probably also know that a very large group of us who were arrested under terror charges are taking the police to court for wrongful arrest. I hope you can relate to this, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from the audience. Franck, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And it's vital, of course, that we continue to create these kind of explicitly anti-Zionist spaces to do what we can to organize and to stand in solidarity with Palestinians as they face this ongoing genocide, almost 2 years now. I was going to talk to you about three things. I was going to share some thoughts on the Terrorism Act 2000. Secondly, I was going to talk about contemporary Zionism and its relationship to contemporary fascism. And then thirdly, I was going to try and outline or sort of sketch a strategy for taking legal, political, and cultural action, sort of designing offensive actions against the racist, arguably fascist ideology of Zionism. So starting with the Terrorism Act 2000, I've become increasingly familiar with it. I've been instructed by a particular client to bring an application under Section 4 of the Terrorism Act, calling for the Islamic resistance movement in Palestine to be removed from the list of banned organizations. And it does seem as though, because of the actions of Palestine Action in particular, that specific piece of legislation finds itself in a crisis. I've spoken previously in various forums about the origins of that legislation. Its precursor legislation comes to us from the occupied north of Ireland. And I don't want to center Ireland too much, but I do think that we learn something about studying the history of these powers and the fact that they were explicitly created to deal with the problem of anti-colonial resistance. So there's a common thread there that I think is worth dwelling on, and it's worth looking at the tactics that were deployed in the Irish struggle against British imperialism when thinking about how we can forge a winning strategy today. I think it would be better to avoid reinventing the wheel. And I think if you look at, for example, the comrades in Derry, they've been extremely militant in showing their solidarity with Palestine Action. And we learned something about why is it that people in the north of Ireland seem to have such sharp politics in this area. And the obvious answer is that we have spent hundreds of years really fighting against this British Empire. I don't want to be too critical of Corbyn. There's a whole discussion taking place right now about this new party that's being formed. But I do think some comradely criticism is useful. Broadly, it does seem as though we're witnessing a political revolution. And it's to be hoped that the Terrorism Act 2000 can be swept up in that political revolution and abolished, right? And I'm here to suggest that that should be our political demand, beyond specific demands relating to individual groups that are caught up in the dragnet of the Terrorism Act 2000. In my opinion, we should be calling for that piece of legislation to be abolished entirely. We should be loudly proclaiming that. We should be thinking strategically about how to create a campaign calling for the abolition of the Terrorism Act 2000. But Corbyn was put on the spot in a recent interview in Middle East Eye, I think it was. And this came in the wake of Zara Sultana MP saying that she was an anti-Zionist. And he gave what I thought was quite a confused answer about the IHRA definition. She had suggested that he had capitulated to Zionists by passing that definition in the Labour Party. I think he could have given a more principled and a sharper answer 22, 23 months into a genocide that's being animated by Zionism. So I think we all need to be much more principled about our opposition to Zionism. And it's to be hoped that those MPs, those left-wing MPs, those now explicitly anti-Zionist MPs, can be won over to explicitly saying that the Terrorism Act 2000 should and could be abolished. I also think it's been disappointing. I represent Hamas under the Terrorism Act. They've asked me to make an application, me and my colleagues, to make an application calling for them to be deprescribed. It's disappointing to me that no mainstream politicians that I'm aware of have yet come out in support of that application. I think that's necessary. I think that if you look at the Irish Republican politicians, Sinn Féin and so forth, these politicians who rightly or have decided to pursue a strategy of so-called abstentionism, right? Run for election in constituencies in the north of Ireland and then refuse to take their seats because they don't recognise the legitimacy of the British colonial parliament. I mean, that organisation was attacked by similar legislation, right? Sinn Féin, Provisional IRA, they were attacked by this sort of mechanism trying to delegitimise people who win elections. It would be better if some of those politicians stuck their head above the parapet and said, you know what, we saw this in the north of Ireland and it was an obstacle to peace. We see this in Palestine, it's an obstacle to peace. It is worth noting that Section 4 says that, quote, an application may be made by A, the organisation, or B, any person affected by the organisation's prescription. And it goes on, but broadly, I think that's interesting. As a matter of strategy and tactics, anyone can make an application under the Terrorism Act. And I think it's a tactical mechanism that's been underutilized. Like more of us could be just making applications saying, you know what, I'm affected by this prescription. I want to talk about peace in Palestine. I want to talk about what's going on in Lebanon with Hezbollah, whatever it might be, and just putting in applications and forcing this genocidal, racist British government to explain itself. And there's a right of appeal under Section 5 to the Prescribed Organisation Appeals Commission. So the government is forced to defend itself. So I think we should be bolder about bringing such applications and about, as I've said, making the broader political demand that, look, this piece of legislation needs to be abolished entirely. The definition of terrorism in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act is staggeringly broad. And it's perhaps unsurprising, but no less disturbing and authoritarian that the current British government has decided to wield that piece of legislation to attack the comrades in Palestine Action. The second thing I was going to talk about was Zionism and contemporary fascism. It seems to me that we cannot be under any illusions about what we are witnessing. We are witnessing the emergence of a 21st century fascism. We see that around the world. We see the morbid symptoms in various contexts. You have this Hindutva movement in India. You have the disturbing sort of attempted putsch by Donald Trump when he was previously president, just January 6th, right? Assault on the institutions of liberal democracy. You see it in Ireland, you see it in France, you see it around the world, in short, right? Fascism is on the rise. We know that contemporary fascism seems to cohere around trying to cultivate the acceptable hatred of the migrant, the figure of the migrant. See that in this country. And the figure of the migrant is often racialized as Muslim. So Islamophobia seems to be extremely integral to contemporary fascism. I also think it's extremely disturbing the way that so many contemporary fascists, not all of them, but most contemporary fascists seem to engage in what's sometimes called philo-Semitism, right? This kind of obnoxious claim to care about Jews, right? The contemporary fascist tends to say, we care about Jews. And so they get to advance this absurdly contradictory claim that they're somehow simultaneously fascist and think that, you know, Muslims should be rounded up and deported and put in camps and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they claim to be the true anti-racists because they're fighting against what they say is anti-Semitism. So I think we need to study this seriously. I think our enemies in the fascist, the apartheid state of Israel, the Zionist entity, as it's often called by Palestinians, it's clear that they are fascists. Bezalel Smotrich is obviously the finance minister, very senior minister in the fugitive of international law, Benjamin Netanyahu's government. So he's a fascist, right? Smotrich tells us that he's a fascist. He doesn't pretend to be anything other than that. We have evidence of Ben Gvir, who's a settler, handing out machine guns to settlers, right? So fascism, sometimes characterized as having a street movement. It's clear that Zionist fascism has a street movement. Like there's a very close relationship between the sitting government and irregular forces, the irregular military force of the settler movement. It's also the case that the Zionist entity, Zionism as an ideology, has always defined the nation in explicitly racist terms. And so it seems to me that we should be at least posing the question rigorously, asking, what does it mean to suggest that Zionism is a fascist ideology, and arriving at robust, reasoned conclusions as to whether or not Zionism is inherently fascist, or whether it has become fascist, and certainly thinking about what it means to organize a strategy that can successfully defeat the fascism that we're witnessing in the Zionist entity. I think that we can do that in court, and it's not that difficult to do in court. In particular, people will be familiar with David Miller's case. What was being said in David Miller's case was an argument about whether or not his views qualified for protection under the Equality Act, right? So he professed anti-Zionist philosophical convictions, and he successfully showed that his views were worthy of respect in a democratic society. That's the test, right? In my opinion, we should be flipping that. we should be going into court and saying Zionism is a fascist ideology. Even if we can't persuade the court of that it's inherently fascist, we can certainly persuade the court that it's inherently racist, that it's colonial, that it's engaged in racial segregation, that it's the official ideology of an apartheid regime. All of these are relatively liberal arguments. It's not difficult to make them. And so we should be making what the lawyers will recognize as an Article 17 argument. So going into court and saying the European Convention has a so-called abuse clause that says when people try to use the rights of this convention to attack other people's rights, then they should lose the protection of the convention. And we should be saying that test is clearly satisfied with almost, if not all, Zionist views. Zionism is a fascist ideology. It's the ideology of an apartheid state. It's not compatible with democracy. It's a profoundly anti-democratic project. So we should normalize anti-Zionism. And in particular, we should be clear that we are all anti-fascist, that Zionism is fascist, or it has at least become fascist. And for that reason, we are all anti-Zionist now. So we should be normalizing the idea that anti-Zionism is the only position to hold. And the only alternative is to side with fascists. The third thing I was going to say briefly, I don't want to take too much time. I said I would say a few words sketching a strategy for legal, political, and cultural offensive actions against Zionism. I've already touched on the legal. I just think that we should go on the offensive. I think Zionism is extremely weak right now. It's not capable of defending itself. You ask the average person on the street in a country, even like Britain, what do you think of Zionists? And most of them will tell you, oh, what, the people who bomb hospitals and murder children. And everyone, like the ordinary people, have just turned decisively against the Zionist project. So I've outlined some legal stuff already. We should go into court and just call a spade a spade. These guys are fascists. They tell us they're fascists. This ideology is profoundly undemocratic and incompatible with human rights, all the rest of it. I think we should go on the offensive. Some people have spoken about suing the police for arresting them. In my opinion, we should be pleading what's called aggravated damages, right? So the section of the pleadings where when we're suing the police, we should say, look, you arrested me. The arrest was unlawful for all the kind of normal liberal reasons. And then we should add aggravated damages sections to our pleadings where we say, we can't understand your decision to arrest me without understanding that the British state has a long-standing policy of support for the colonial project of Zionism. We know that because the British Empire literally administered the Palestine Mandate. We know that from the Balfour Declaration. There's no basis for denying that the British state is thoroughly Zionist as a matter of policy. And that is why you are engaged in all of this unlawful arresting of people who attempt to challenge your policy of Zionism while you commit a genocide. We should just go into court and say all of that and say your decision to arrest me was aggravated by the fact that you are currently participating in a genocide. And increasingly, I find myself doing that in the cases on which I'm instructed. When people are defending themselves against so-called regulatory prosecutions, we should turn prosecutions of individual professions, right? Doctor or a lawyer or someone who's facing criticism from their professional regulator because they took to social media to criticize the fascist ideology of Zionism while it commits a genocide. We should simply turn those cases around and say, the British state has no business to lecture anyone on how to avoid racism. You are engaged in this genocide. It's not merely that the Zionist entity is doing it. You're doing it. You're running spy flights. You're selling bombs and military equipment. You're running diplomatic cover. You're involved in the mass murder of Palestinians because you view them as a racial threat. You have no authority to criticize my client for doing some tweets. Like, my client may have tweeted some stuff. At least he didn't murder any Palestinian children. More or less going into court and saying that stuff. As to cultural spaces, I just think this is kind of low-hanging fruit, and I'm surprised we haven't seen more of it. Some spaces have sprung up, but I think we should be organizing film nights, like find relatively mainstream cinemas and just say, right, once a month we want to organize an anti-Zionist film screening of XYZ, screen the Battle of Algiers, get ideas from other anti-colonial resistance struggles, create museums. I was very inspired by the Museum of Neoliberalism, brilliant, blistering critique of neoliberalism. We should just create the Museum of Zionism, and people can just show up and educate themselves about what Zionism is. Anti-Zionist chess clubs, like anti-Zionist football clubs. We should just normalize the idea that anti-Zionism is akin to or is of a piece with anti-fascism. And as for politics, I mean, I defer to the people who are more actively engaged in the expressly political struggle. I often find that I feel a bit exhausted with witnessing the genocide, and I feel a pronounced sense of survivor's guilt. Like, I live in London, which is very safe, and I just don't really understand why I should be so safe when all my comrades in Palestine are being murdered like this. But it seems to me that we are witnessing a political revolution. You see that with Zoran Mamdani in New York. You see that with, Zara Sultana and the emergence of anti-Zionism as a mainstream parliamentary political force. So we should continue to deepen the crisis of Zionism and come together in spaces like this to come up with a strategy by which we smash Zionism. We smash Zionism because we smash fascism, and we smash fascism because the alternative is to allow the fascists to win. And I don't want to live on a planet where the fascists win. So we just got to keep picking ourselves up, finding more strategic ways to fight more effectively until Zionism is defeated entirely and the apartheid state of Israel is dismantled and replaced with a democracy.
Thank you, Frank. Smash Zionism, smash fascism, bravo. And I can see a comment from a comrade in chat. This is an excellent presentation, one of the best I've heard. This really goes to the jug there, bravo. So thank you very much, Frank. There are numerous questions that we'll come back to in the Q&A.